Welcome to Myanmar Musings, a podcast of the Myanmar Research Centre at the Australian National University, Canberra. I'm Luke Corbin. It's November 18, 2020, and today we are talking with Dr. Stephen Campbell, who is Assistant Professor in the School of Social Sciences at Nanyang Technological University, Singapore. Stephen is an anthropologist, a theorist of capitalism, and an expert on Burmese migrant labour issues in Thailand. Hello, Stephen.
Hello, Luke. Thanks for inviting me.
My absolute pleasure. Today we're discussing your stimulating book, Border Capitalism, Disrupted. But before we get into the meaty parts of your book, and what this border capitalism is and how it's being disrupted, I thought we could begin with the COVID-19 pandemic and what's happening today. So up until this year, there were still millions of Burmese migrant workers in Thailand. But right now, Myanmar's being ravaged by COVID-19 and Thailand is doing comparatively better. At the beginning of the outbreak, thousands of Burmese workers left Thailand to come back to Myanmar, but subsequently, as they go months without income and as COVID-19 worsens in Myanmar, many of them are heading back in the other direction, back to Thailand. And there have been arrests there of returnees appearing in the news. So I wonder, what's the state of mobility and the labour regimes in COVID abnormal 2020? Has border capitalism been disrupted?
Well, I think that, of course, COVID has added some new dimensions, new challenges and restrictions on cross-border travel. But in many respects, the kinds of issues about arrest and the difficulty and challenges for mobility for Myanmar migrants in Thailand are very similar to what has happened for decades in Thailand. And so it's perhaps a slightly more precarious and extreme extension of what was already there, but in many ways it's not particularly different. And I think that it would be something that's important to keep in mind, because there have been a few high profile cases recently that in the news that, of course, understandably foreground the COVID situation in order to contextualize certain cases of migrants who are, for example, not paid their wages or who are arbitrarily dismissed from work without compensation. And so in order to contextualize it, oftentimes journalists will frame it in terms of the COVID context. But in many ways, this is in fact just the standard procedures in Mae Sot in particular, but also in many other places where migrants are working in Thailand. So I do think that continuity is important to keep in mind, despite, of course, recognizing that COVID adds its own dimension and new elements of restrictions on border travel and the mass return initially that we saw earlier this year of Myanmar migrants to Myanmar.
Do you think that COVID-19 is encouraging any either state actors or other actors or workers themselves to reconsider their priority or the status quo of arrangements? Are you seeing or hearing anything like that?
Well, I think that, of course, with migrants having to return home earlier this year, there was a lot of sense like that this was, at least for the short term, that it wasn't viable to stay in Thailand, which of course makes sense. But the kinds of arrangements, there's no indication that, for example, Thailand plans, at least that I've seen, that Thailand plans to move away from migrant workers. And I really don't think it's that their current economic model works without low-wage migrant workers. So the idea that the Thai government, and of course Thailand has its own fascinating political dynamics going on at the moment in more urban areas. But the idea that any Thai government would say, okay, because of the volatility of the world market, as we see in the COVID situation, we can no longer depend on low-wage migrant workers. Therefore, we're going to move to a different model that employs primarily Thais. I think that's unrealistic. There's no indication that would happen because the numbers are a bit unclear, but for a long time, the figure that was given was something between like 3 to 4 million migrant workers in Thailand. And this is a significant portion of the labor force. And for all of the various restrictions that are in place, it creates a very low-waged workforce that in many ways sustains the Thai economy. From all the way from, in Mae Sot, where I did research with low-wage workers employed in garment factories, to things like people selling in the large malls that we see in Bangkok that are Myanmar migrants who are doing jobs that Thais generally do not want to do. So I don't see any indication of a significant rethinking of that model from the Thai side. And from the Myanmar side, it's long been the case that the possibility of working as migrants abroad has in some ways lessened the pressure domestically, the political pressure domestically to provide a alternative social economic organization, new social policies, because if individuals who cannot support themselves domestically are able to go abroad to find waged work, then that's it reduces pressure on the government to, for example, provide more social welfare programs or address issues of landlessness. But the fact that all of these people have returned recently, that I think does put in increased pressure on the government. And I think we do see the limited viability of an economic development model that's based on precarious low-wage employment. Because as soon as there is a sort of a disruption of production, and because of we're so interconnected globally now that these things reverberate domestically in Myanmar regardless, is that we'll see a situation where the economic model is not able to maintain some kind of livelihood for so many people in the country. So people who have left rural areas, the promise, of course, this is part of the transition discourse in Myanmar, is that the promise is that it's okay that people are being pushed out of rural areas because, of course, those were low productivity agrarian livelihoods anyway, and they're moving to urban areas, whether in Thailand or to industrial zones around Yangon, and they're going into these sort of good, so-called good formal sector jobs. But we see that when there's a situation like COVID, and of course, COVID was very unexpected, but it in many ways just draws out or reveals the underlying precarity and insecurity that's kind of the basis of this model that suggests that we can just have this mass migration out of rural areas to urban areas because of these, we can rely on these low-wage jobs, but the low-wage jobs can disappear so quickly, as we're seeing with people who have lost employment in Myanmar or migrants from Thailand and other countries who are forced to return. So I think this should, in fact, provoke a rethinking of the approach to development and the sort of development model that's prominent in Myanmar all across the political spectrum. But I actually don't think it's likely to do that. It should, but I don't think it will.
In my own fieldwork, I often encounter domestic migrants and, instances of domestic migration. My primary field site is in Yangon, the biggest city, which is growing and swelling with domestic migrants day by day. However, in academia and the public discourse, domestic migration gets kind of short shrift in Myanmar compared to other countries. And I wonder whether it's sort of, in the academic sphere at least, been replaced by the Thailand border migrant sort of literature. Do you see something there, or am I misrepresenting the way that people talk about domestic migration in Myanmar?
I think you're completely correct to highlight the significance of domestic migration. And in many ways, it's the scale is higher. The extent of domestic migration is in fact higher than the percentage of people that are going abroad. Perhaps in terms of academic studies that people find transnational migration to be a more sexy topic. I'm not sure. But following my research in Mae Sot and in Thailand, I've been doing research with domestic migrants in Myanmar, in the industrial zones around Yangon. And there are in many ways very similar dynamics going on. Of course, also many differences. But I do think that the scale of domestic migration in Myanmar deserves further critical scrutiny and theorization, conceptualization, and especially on the ground domestically, some more significant political response that actually addresses the concerns of domestic migrants, as we're seeing, of course, in the COVID situation, because a lot of the people that are migrating to urban areas find that the housing market in a place like Yangon is so high that it's very difficult to access rental housing. And so this is a big factor in the growth of these squatter settlements around Yangon. And again, this urbanization and this domestic migration process is part of what is largely called the transition now. And the promise that is laid out by the government, by organizations like the World Bank, for example, and even by various NGOs and academics as well, is that, well, this is part of this economic transition that will, of course, lead to a growth in time of good formal sector jobs for people who leave these rural areas and into the cities. And so far, there's been very little incorporation of people who have left rural areas into jobs that are formal sector, formal in the sense of being meeting the bare legal minimum in wages and working conditions that are set by Myanmar labor law, which is actually quite a low bar to measure these things against. But if you talk to a lot of people in urban areas who have migrated from rural areas, and you get in a conversation about their actual, it's difficult if people are actually working at the time, like if you're in a restaurant, but it's interesting to just talk to people in various walks of life about what they're actually earning and how many days a week they're working, how many days a month they're working, do they get time off? Because I often find that I enter these conversations and it's just extremely, of course, disappointing, but not surprising that people often have very egregious working conditions with wages well below the legal minimum. And these are, if we don't look more deeply, they appear from the outside to be these sort of formal sector jobs. But it's a very misleading concept, this formal sector. And so I think a lot of the domestic migrants in Myanmar are coming to the city on this promise. But the conditions that they encounter are far short of what is being promised by this transition narrative.
Okay, thinking about Thailand again, this may seem like a flippant question, but before we talk about Mae Sot in particular, people in Myanmar often say that Mae Sot is a Burmese town, Chiang Mai is a Shan town, and Bangkok is a Karen town. Is that a useful simplification? Where's that come from?
It makes a certain sense. Of course, it's not entirely true, because Mae Sot, Bangkok, and Chiang Mai all have a diversity of migrants from Myanmar of diverse ethnicities. But it comes, of course, from a longer history of migration that often works through chain migration into Thailand. So when migration really picked up in the 1990s, because of the civil war in eastern Myanmar, it was often more difficult for Burma from central Myanmar to travel to the border and to migrate to Thailand. And so the people initially who were migrating to Thailand to work were often people who were residing in Karen State, Kaya, Shan. And so they migrated to Thailand, and the working conditions and the wages in Bangkok are higher than in Mae Sot. And so people who have a longer established presence in Thailand eventually made their way to Bangkok, and then through connections and chain migration are able to put their relatives and their friends in touch with employers in some place like Bangkok. So this is just part of the dynamic. Of course, there's other aspects to it, but I've often seen that people who have migrated to Thailand or who have had like their parents had also worked in Thailand have connections, are more likely to be able to make it down to somewhere like Bangkok, where the wages are generally higher. They may not be equivalent to the legal minimum wage, but they're in most cases higher than in Mae Sot. Whereas for Burma, that has been more recent, like since the 2000s, and the decrease in the fighting in Karen State, and the increased ability of Burma people from places like Bago, for example, to travel to the border and then into Thailand. And so without having these connections to someplace like Bangkok, they're often found it more difficult to get to central Thailand because there are restrictions by the Thai government that prevent people from the border areas. So it's quite easy to get into Thailand or to cross the border. That's actually for the migrants in Mae Sot, but it's quite difficult to go from Mae Sot to Bangkok. So one of the effects of this has led to this lower wage in Mae Sot and this relatively higher wage in a place like Bangkok. So not having the connections or the resources that allow a person to go from Mae Sot to Bangkok leaves them stuck in Mae Sot with lower wages. And similarly for Chiang Mai, of course, this relative larger scale of Shan migrants who have come from Shan State. And so your initial division there with those three cities, I think there is something to it, and it does reflect a certain aspect of the history of migration from Myanmar to Thailand. But of course, at the moment, things are a bit more complex, and there's a lot more diversity with the migrants who are in those towns. And then, of course, under COVID, with people returning, things have also changed.
For English-speaking foreigners, they will know what Bangkok is and probably know what Chiang Mai is, but Mae Sot is a bit more obscure. This is the town that you did most of your fieldwork. This is the town on the border with Myanmar, and it was only connected to the Thai metropole with roads, built for counterinsurgency, apparently, in the 70s. And then by the 80s was a site of refuge, then host to thousands of non-Thai residents in formal and informal categories. And it also has an entrenched humanitarian industry. So could you please introduce and colour the important parts of Mae Sot and the people who move through it that this brief overview glosses?
Okay, well, I think you've covered some important aspects. Of course, a lot of the Karen refugees or internally displaced Karen up until the 80s, many of them had been able to live at other villages in Karen state, but increasingly in the 80s and 90s, that became unviable. So a lot of the internally displaced Karen became refugees in Thailand in the late 80s and 90s, and that then led to a growth of the humanitarian organizations that were supporting them. Many of them had been organizations that were supporting the Indo-Chinese refugees in eastern and southeastern Thailand. So there was this growth of these important organizations that were supporting Karen refugees in the Mae Sot area. And I guess since we're on audio, I'll explain that Mae Sot is roughly maybe halfway between Bangkok and Chiang Mai, but then west right along the Myanmar border. And it's opposite Karen state, and the largest town on the Karen side would be Pa'an. So then in the early 1990s, there was some agricultural work that was done in the area, but very little industrial work. But in 1997, there was the so-called Asian financial crisis. And this led to a significant restructuring of industry in Thailand. So up until then, a lot of factories had been based around Bangkok. And Thailand had a very large garment industry that was employing overwhelmingly internal Thai migrants from the northeast, from Isan, which is the generally poorer area of Thailand. So those were internal or domestic migrants in Thailand who were working in the garment sector. But then at the Asian financial crisis, there was this restructuring and what has been called a flexibilization of labor in Thailand, where part of this involved a relocation of factories from the Bangkok area to the less regulated border areas. And for this, Mae Sot was, for the garment sector, probably the most important site of relocation. So a lot of these factories moved to Mae Sot because among the advantages, it had easier access to this pool of low-waged migrant workers from Myanmar. It was also less outside the scope of regulation and government regulation that was in the Bangkok area. And when garment factories were around Bangkok, we had a dynamic that's actually interestingly similar to what we see in Yangon right now. But there was a lot of engagement by Bangkok-based activists and organizers with garment sector factory workers. So as a result, the garment sector Thai garment workers were able to organize and mobilize and make these collective political demands beginning in sort of the late 80s and early 90s. So one of the advantages to the Thai government and to employers by relocating to Mae Sot is that they got rid of this politicized movement of activists and workers and industrial workers. So I just mentioned that because it's interesting that in Yangon, there's a similar dynamic where you have a lot of organizations and labor organizers and activists who are engaged and supportive of the factory workers who are working in the industrial zones around Yangon. Mm. So anyway, in the late 1980s, there was this relocation of factories to Mae Sot, and the industrial garment sector really boomed in Mae Sot since around the 2000s. And because of its location, there was a sort of local way in which local authorities and employers were able to establish a very restrictive labor regime that was able to keep wages very low in Mae Sot. Of course, one of the ways was by employing migrant workers from Myanmar, who typically were undocumented because, as I mentioned, it's quite easy to cross from Myanmar into Thailand across the border there. But as migrant workers, they are legally prohibited in Thailand from establishing unions. And technically or legally, they can join a union, but there were no Thai industrial unions in Mae Sot. So it was effectively, unionization was effectively barred there. And the police were often closely aligned with employers and the Thai Federation of Industries in Mae Sot, so that if there was an issue, like if workers made a collective demand, the employer could simply call the police and have all of these workers deported, and then very quickly rehire a new workforce, or at least use this as a threat against workers for making collective demands. So all of this led to a suppression of wages and a suppression of costs in Mae Sot, which of course made this attractive to international brands who wanted to produce clothing at a very low price. So the attractiveness of Mae Sot as a site for the production of garments for international brands was based on very restrictive and in many cases coercive labor regime in Mae Sot. And so it grew to a situation where we had a few hundred factories and a very large population of migrants from Myanmar who vastly outnumbered the local Thai population. And so this is this dynamic of low wages, coercive policing of undocumented migrants alongside this refugee population who was, the camps were outside of Mae Sot, but nonetheless nearby. And then you had these humanitarian organizations, international organizations, UN organizations who often focus their support, understandably, on supporting refugees. But at the same time, it often led to this neglect of the concerns of migrant workers who, in many cases, the lines between them are blurred because some people, we had, for example, migrants or refugees from Karen State who fled, and instead of going to the refugee camps, they went to Mae Sot and got jobs in factories. But based on the motivations for them leaving, they could be classified as refugees. And this also led, of course, due to the political dynamics in Myanmar, to the growth of these political organizations, or not the growth, but the movement of political organizations, these so-called pro-democracy organizations, for example, and the growth of human rights organizations that were focused on the situation in Myanmar to be based in Mae Sot as well. And so there was, in the late 90s and the 2000s, up until around 2010, quite a big presence of Burmese, especially from the Central Burma political activists and organizations who were also there. So it led to a really interesting dynamic where you had all of these different groups present, and then you had a lot of young backpackers, foreign backpackers, who would often go and volunteer to be English teachers there as well. And so this very interesting dynamic of all of these different groups came together in Mae Sot. Since 2010-11, a lot of all of the Burmese political organizations have returned to Myanmar or otherwise dissolved. And a lot of the funding has dried up for refugee and migrant worker organizations there. But there's still, of course, this huge presence of Myanmar migrant workers in Mae Sot, even though Mae Sot in many ways has lost the spotlight. For a while, it was in the international spotlight as being sort of the hub of the Burmese pro-democracy movement. And that attention has gone away, even though the concerns for migrants in Mae Sot in the area, and of course, there's still a large presence of refugees along the border.
And when you go to Mae Sot and you look at the Friendship Bridge and the big imposing checkpoint, and then you look at a map and you see the line of the border, it seems very real, very serious. In fact, as you've touched on the labour regime and on workers' lives, in many ways, this border defines their experience. So how do the people in your book and the workers in Mae Sot think about and use the border in academic terms? So how is the social construct of the border produced by practice?
Well, people are very aware, even though it's we call it a porous border, it's very easy to cross. At least in the Mae Sot area, people are very aware of the border because when they do cross, although it's very easy to do this without going through the official checkpoint, immediately upon stepping onto Thai soil, there's this threat of the police, at least in the Mae Sot area. And so you can cross, but then people have to start thinking about avoiding the police. And the police, interestingly, are not in practice making a serious attempt to prevent undocumented migrants from being in Mae Sot. One would think, based on the way of the language of the law and regulation and policing, that they would be trying to prevent this. But there's a way in which there's a selective targeting of migrants. And of course, in most cases, when police stop migrants, it leads to simply extortion on relatively small scale. It can, of course, be very significant for the migrant involved. But at least during the time of my research, there would be this equivalent to what we might say like 1 or 2 days' wages for a factory worker would be extorted by the police in order to let the migrant go on their way. So for many people, this was the cost of living and working in Mae Sot. And interestingly or oddly, it often was more affordable to simply gamble on encountering the police and paying these relatively small bribes instead of doing the official registration process, which was often in the thousands of baht, or much larger. So people would have this ongoing sense of insecurity, but it was kind of ambiguous because for people who had been there for a long time in Mae Sot, especially people who had learned a little bit of Thai language ability, that their concern about the Thai policing, at least within Mae Sot, declined, or at least they learned how to engage the police, how to pay these bribes, and often how to avoid the police, which roads, for example, were often had checkpoints. People would learn these and would avoid them. Or people would simply, for some people, just not leave the factory because the police, unless the employer called the police generally left the factories alone. And so if a factory was employing a workforce of undocumented migrants, even if it's 1,000 undocumented migrants, the police would know that those migrants were there and were undocumented, but would simply not bother because it was not in their interest or in the employer's interest for there to be any kind of crackdown. And this was much different once you leave Mae Sot because there's a border checkpoint or there's a checkpoint on the road out of Mae Sot. And that's where undocumented migrants are actually stopped and prevented from going into central Thailand. And that's because of this internal border around Mae Sot. This is the basis for a lot of the human smuggling and trafficking and the much more dangerous and vulnerable kind of routes to get to higher wage employment in Bangkok.
And you mention one tactic that a worker used is to carry a lemon on them. What is the purpose of that?
That was a unique case. It was this, as many listeners who are familiar with Myanmar will know, this idea of yariache, which is to perform a certain prescriptive action that will somehow counter a likely harm that they're going to confront. So if you go to an astrologer or a fortune teller who tells you, oh, there's a risk of this happening to you in the future, then you should do this action. This was, of course, I don't know if it's apocryphal, but this account of why Myanmar in the cars drive on the right side of the road is because that there was somebody told Ne Win that he was going to face this threat from the left, meaning like the Communist Party. But so he switched all the cars to be driving on the right side of the road. And I actually don't know if there's any basis to that. But anyway, the idea is that you do these actions that can counter a potential threat. So this one individual said that he kept the lemon in his pocket because a lemon being acidic, it has some sort of medicinal property that would somehow make it unlikely that the police would stop him. He seemed confident about this and he felt that it had worked for him. I'm not sure I would be as confident if I was in his place, but it was definitely an interesting strategy, somewhat unique though.
And also these kinds of things can reproduce themselves, or people can be socialized into them. You mentioned you've seen on multiple occasions Burmese migrant parents discipline their children with the words, "If you don't stop crying, the police will come and arrest you." And this is profoundly sad. But you make the point that capitalist orders which you're talking about have always depended on coercion and other extra economic factors to function. So do you want to draw any links here to these kinds of systemic points?
Yeah, well, maybe that's one thread that runs through it. And of course, it comes into my more recent research where sometimes people have a very formal understanding of how capitalism works, about it being based on market pressures, about people accepting jobs just because of economic reasons, and a very economistic conception of how capitalist orders operate. But I think that when we see in practice that there's all of these forms of course, this coercion by the police is an important part in Mae Sot, but this is imbricated with these ideas, forms of meaning that inform action. And in this case, the way that children come to understand that they live in a context where they face the threat of the police, that this leads to an internalization of fear that in fact shapes their practices and their behavior in terms of seeking employment, or not seeking support for example, if they're factory workers and they know that they're not being paid the legal minimum wage or they're not getting what they're legally due, many people are nonetheless concerned that if they leave the factory and seek support from the Thai government for a redress of legal labor rights violations, which in Thailand they're legally eligible to do, even undocumented migrants. And I think this is very important. In Mae Sot, there's the Labor Protection Office. In practice, however, many migrants, because of this coercive policing context in Mae Sot, the threat of arrest and extortion and deportation by the Thai police, that many migrants are understandably wary of venturing outside of their workplace in order to claim their legal rights. And so this sort of sense of vulnerability, the concern about coercive policing, is an important component of the Mae Sot labor regime. And it's an important reason why wages are so low and so much lower than what is legally due to migrants. Because migrants, also an important factor, is that migrants in Thailand, even if they're undocumented, are, according to Thai labor law, legally eligible to obtain the minimum wage, the legal minimum wage.
And I think another way we could look at this is that in your book, you are very careful not to ascribe too much agency to other workers or to capitalists, and you refer to Mae Sot as having a labour regime that is instead an outcome of workers' struggles and capitalist recuperation. What does this mean? And can you give us some concrete examples of how struggles become recuperations?
There's a lot of important work that's been done on labor regulation and on the regulation of migrant labor in Mae Sot specifically. Before my own research, there was some important research done by the Thai academic Pitch Pongsawat and by an American academic, Dennis Arnold, who looked at the ways in which migrants were very coercively regulated at the border, and the way that the border was created this site of exclusion where migrants were excluded from the norm of legal labor rights in Thailand. And that was very important research that was done before I started my own research. But one of the things that came up in my own research was that this is part of the story. There's an assumption that labor regimes are imposed from the top down. And we're often very familiar with this term, the race to the bottom, where because of global competition, the wages and employment conditions for low-wage industrial workers around the world are suppressed. And this is true, and this is an important part of the analysis. But what we see in Mae Sot, interestingly, was that migrant workers had, in fact, made various kinds of struggles, like, for example, most prominently, we would see factory strikes. But there was also attempts to leave Mae Sot and to migrate out of Mae Sot. And there was also the establishment of Myanmar labor activist organizations that put pressure on the Thai government. So I mentioned earlier that in Mae Sot, there is a branch of the Thai government's Labor Protection Office, which is an office where migrant workers, even if they're undocumented, can go and submit claims for legal wages and legal labor rights. This office was initially non-existent in Thailand. And it was only in the early 2000s, after migrants and migrant organizations had been doing a lot of advocacy, often working closely with sympathetic Thai organizations, that they were able to push the Thai government to open this office in Mae Sot. And of course, there are a lot of, as I mentioned, barriers to migrants actually accessing that office. Nonetheless, some migrants have in fact made it to that office, made claims, and have actually won financial redress in the form of back pay or payment for having been paid less than the legal minimum wage, for example. So the fact of this office being there, if we were only going to understand Mae Sot as a site of exception where the government and employers have imposed the most oppressive labor regime in order to maintain low wages, then we would not expect to see that office there at all. But the fact that migrants have had some success, admittedly it's a limited success, but has had some success in pushing the government to do this, it is given some opportunity that lets us see how this conflict between migrant workers, the government, and the employer have played out, such that the situation at the Mae Sot border industrial zone cannot simply be explained as either the outcome of the race to the bottom or the outcome of a government, like an ideal, a kind of neoliberal fantasy of low-waged employment. So some of these struggles are important for better understanding the particularity of Mae Sot. And there was also a conflict that's relevant between, at least when I was doing my research, between employers and government officials in central Thailand and employers and local government officials in Mae Sot, because in the early 2000s, when Thaksin Shinawatra was in power in Thailand, one of his interesting approaches to migrant workers was in a very pro-business perspective. He wanted to make it easier for migrants to travel from the border to central Thailand so that employers in central Thailand would have more access to low-wage migrant workers. So this was not necessarily, like, he was not doing this for any benevolent reasons towards migrant workers, but it was more to support Thai employers. But nonetheless, it had the effect of making it easier for migrants to travel in Thailand. And so as a result, many of them wanted to leave Mae Sot and move to these higher wage jobs in central Thailand. So many of them did that. But then there was a counter push by employers and local officials in Mae Sot who saw that this was a threat to Mae Sot. It was a threat to the low-wage labor regime in Mae Sot. If all of these migrants just passed through Mae Sot and went to central Thailand for these higher-paying jobs, then Mae Sot would not be viable anymore. So there was this attempt by the local officials and local employers to restrict migrants' travel. So it led to these certain kinds of policing on this internal border around Mae Sot. So this is another aspect in which this conflict, in this case between central Thailand's government officials at a federal level or at a national level, and employers in central Thailand were in conflict with local officials and local employers. And that conflict led to certain particularities in the border industrial zones labor regime in Mae Sot.
And this is a far too simple question, so I'll augment it. But did you meet any good bosses in Mae Sot? And by that, I am kind of getting at that we get a lot of workers' voices in your book, and we have a lot of sort of secondary information about the state and the police and employers. And I would wonder if the voices of the police or of bosses influenced your writing in any way. And I'm also just curious about this group of employers, capitalists, whether they are seen as heroes or villains in Thai society, if they're seen as exploiting or if they're driving the economy forward and building the nation. And, you know, things to do with distinction, like what is it to live in Bangkok and be middle class and have a karen made? You know, is that sort of a status thing? So I just want to hear more about that side, if it's okay.
Sure. Well, I'll try. I think there's a lot there to that question, but I'll try to just offer some comments. I think that there were, of course, my research was mostly with migrants. So, and because I was often with migrants who were in conflicts with employers, that whenever I encountered factory owners, they generally didn't have they weren't really quite happy to engage with me. So, for example, being at the labor protection office with migrants who were at another opposite end of a table to employers who were in conflict with them, they didn't really appreciate my presence. The employers didn't really appreciate my presence there. So as a result, it created some difficulty for doing interviews with them. But I think it is relevant to highlight that not all employers are exactly the same. So there are some who are, paying relatively higher wages, or who are less insidious in their persecution of migrants who would, try to ask for higher wages or ask for some sort of improvement in their conditions. But on the whole, I mean, the viability of Mae Sot is based on maintaining very low wages and very cheap working conditions. So going from simply what migrant workers have told me about their experiences in Mae Sot, there was very little, especially in large factories, very little to commend about the employers. There were some factories, I think, out of like 200 to 300 factories, interestingly, there was like one or two that people would say like, oh, that factory, there's that one factory where they paid a legal minimum wage. And it was, people knew the factory. And then sometimes people who are working in smaller shops, in the market, for example, they might have a good relationship with their employer. So some of those employers might be perceived as a bit more sympathetic. And I even talked to one domestic worker I remember in Mae Sot who, I was expecting her to be quite critical of her employer, but she spoke quite highly of them and their willingness to kind of bring her into their family, because she had worked with them for quite a long time and was very close to them. So definitely there's some diversity among employers, but I would say it's very difficult for an employer to say, I will be a good employer, I will be a good person, and I will pay the legal minimum wage, and I will give workers what they are legally due, because if they did that, they would not be competitive in Mae Sot. So I don't think it's so much that an employer is a bad person or a good person. It's just the dynamics of Mae Sot don't really allow for a generous employer, even if there was such a thing.
All right, and we're coming towards the end now, and I just wanted to ask about the sort of broader approach that you decided to take when you wrote this book. That being because, as you've said, there are so many Burmese in Thailand. Many of them over the previous decades have been refugees. There's a bit of fuzziness between the categories of refugees and of workers, and many of these people have, suffered a lot, and there's a lot to say about them. So I guess the question is, what inspired you to write about these people through the lens of capitalism, using the theories of capitalism? I suppose you could go into what the state of capitalist theory is now in 2020, nearly 2 centuries after Karl Marx.
Okay, well, I think one of the motivating factors is that there has been a long. I lived in Mae Sot for several years before I started my PhD and my research for my PhD, and I think there's a long history of writing in English about Myanmar that isn't framed in terms of kind of the pro-democracy movement and military rule in Myanmar, and of course that's all been very important research and writing, but it often did not, in my view, at least in my reading, did not take into account a lot of the kind of the political economy that was underlying a lot of these issues. And as a result, it tended to gloss over a lot of what I thought were important issues. And so people who are writing in English, who are based in Thailand, but writing about Myanmar issues, would tend to focus either on the situation of refugees in the camps, which is, of course, a very important issue, or they had long focused on this pro-democracy movement. And the pro-democracy movement was also, of course, a very important issue, but it didn't seem to accurately address this distinction between a lot of the activists from Yangon or from Burman parts of the country that in some respects were relatively privileged. Relatively, I say that. But, and I think that looking at the experiences of migrant workers definitely was less represented, I think, in the Myanmar studies literature. And looking at a kind of a working class perspective was not prevalent in the Myanmar studies literature. So I do think that that's an important aspect and element that I hope that there's kind of further research in. And I think now there is. But I do think that globally also since 2007, the 2007-8 global crisis, that there's been increased interest in academic studies of political economy and of capitalism specifically. And a lot of it's very creative, rethinking of how we understand capitalism. not only the dynamics of capitalism today and of the global political economy, but also how it is epistemologically that we approach the understanding of capitalism and how it works. And so there's been a lot of important theorization of this, of capitalism. So in that sense, I think one could perhaps, in hindsight, place that my research and my decision to do that research, and it makes sense, even though I think maybe I was less aware of it at the time, but it kind of fits into a particular history of local Myanmar studies research and kind of what I saw at the time as in kind of a adding to that kind of a working class and a political economic perspective, but also globally this increased interest in capitalism and in theorizing capitalism. So nowadays, like when we have an issue like COVID, for example, which is very prominent, in order to understand what's going on for the lives of domestic migrants in Myanmar and migrants who were in Thailand formerly and who may have returned, we can't really understand the dynamics and effects of COVID unless we understand how the capitalist context in which this is playing out. And so hopefully in Myanmar studies, people will kind of increasingly take into account these questions of political economy, even if I think for a wide range of topics that people focus on in Myanmar studies, ranging from, religion to agrarian change to development to politics to gender dynamics and ethnicity. All of these, I think, could benefit from bringing in at least a certain element of thinking about how they relate to Myanmar's current changing political economy and the ongoing changes in capitalism in Myanmar.
Yeah, and I believe that you have shifted your focus to mostly doing fieldwork and publishing from within Myanmar, if I'm not mistaken. So could you please let us know about some of the exciting research you've done subsequent to this excellent book, Border Capitalism Disrupted?
Well, after finishing my research in Thailand with Myanmar migrants, I wanted to look at this issue of more domestic migration within Myanmar and the changing political economy in Myanmar, especially in the context of what's widely called as sort of the transition, and really question some of the assumptions underlying the transition narrative by looking at the experiences of domestic migrants, people leaving rural areas and moving to urban areas in the city. So I've been, since 2016, I suppose, I started doing research in Myanmar, especially around Yangon. So I did research on initially some things like the restructuring of the construction sector in Yangon. I did some research on the inland fisheries in the Delta. And more recently, especially last year in 2019, I was doing a project for the University of Bergen in Norway that was involved. I was living most of the year just outside of Yangon in an industrial zone, looking at the lives and livelihoods of a community of people living at a squatter settlement. The settlement was about 1,000 households. So I was interested in the ways in which people were working in livelihoods and forms of work that were not what is promised by this transition narrative in terms of these good formal sector jobs. So people are engaged in a wide range of livelihoods that are very much incorporated into the industrialization process that we're seeing around Yangon, but they're still not the kinds of jobs that would seem to meet the promise of this well-remunerated wage labor backed by legal rights according to labor law. So my research is focused on these forms of informal labor at a squatter settlement just outside of Yangon. So I have a new book that I've written about that. So I'm still waiting to hear back from the publisher, but hopefully before too long, we'll see that come out.
Wow, that sounds fantastic. Looking forward to that. Okay. The last question we always ask is, do you have a recommendation you could make for our listeners? So you can just recommend anything for people listening to seek out. It could be a book or a film or a piece of art or a place to walk or something to eat. Anything to do with Myanmar or maybe Myanmar and the working class.
Okay, well, I'll try to answer that by saying that, especially for people who are Myanmar studies researchers or academics or students, that I have a strong kind of sympathy for the Burmese literature that came out between basically independence to the early 60s. And I really hope that there will be some young academic who decides as their PhD project to do a study of Burmese leftist literature from the 1950s. And there's some brilliant authors, of whom my favorite is Bamotin Ong, but there are many others. And I think it would be a wonderful contribution to Myanmar studies if we had an English language engagement with Burmese literature from that period, because it's so rich. And unfortunately for those of us for whom Burmese is not our first language, it either takes quite a long time to get through reading a Burmese book, or it might be even inaccessible. So if somebody decides that they're looking for a research project, I would strongly encourage people to pursue that, or even simply people who are learning Burmese to take advantage of that literature as an entry point to learning Burmese in more depth. What's your favorite book from that oeuvre? So Bamotin Ong was this very important public intellectual in the especially the 50s and 60s. And so one of my favorite of his book is called Nga'aw, and it's basically an alternative narrative of the Seasan Revolution, the 1930-31 peasant uprising. And it's more what we might call like a kind of a history from below, and about how the peasants sort of organized themselves. And it offers an alternative reading of that event that's not so much about Seasan going and organizing the peasants, but about the peasants organizing themselves. And so it's quite nice. And he has another book, this one called Yoma Taipwe. Oh. So Yoma Taipwe, it's a very short book. So for foreigners who are learning Burmese, it's not too daunting to do this, but this is about the anti-fascist underground in World War II. And it looks at the collaboration between Karen villagers and Burmese villagers in organizing these anti-fascist guerrilla units in World War II. And it offers a lot of thoughts on that historical moment, but also a lot of hopeful possibilities for interethnic solidarity in Myanmar, and the sorts of an alternative approach to interethnic peace building that's not focused on sort of military negotiations that are quite prominent now. Okay, so that was Yoma Taipwe by Bamotin Ong, and the other book was called Nga'aw by Bamotin Ong. Thank you for those excellent recommendations. I'll go and check them out, though I imagine that a lot of the vocabulary will be new to me. And thank you so much, Stephen Campbell, for coming on Myanmar Musings. Thank you for having me. I really enjoyed the talk.